My name is Victoria. I'm in my early 30s now, and for most of my life, I've been known as the steady one, the reasonable one, the quiet presence in the room who doesn't demand much attention. I work in a field where listening matters more than speaking, where details and patience are mistaken for softness. People often assume I'm agreeable, flexible, and endlessly understanding. They assume that because I don't raise my voice, I don't have a spine. I've learned that being underestimated doesn't always come from being weak. Sometimes it comes from being deliberate. This story isn't about revenge, or exposing anyone, or dramatizing pain for sympathy. It's about emotional justice, the kind that doesn't announce itself. It's about how love, even sincere love, can exist alongside limits that were never meant to be crossed. And it's about what happens when you finally understand the difference between belonging and being kept. For a long time, I believed I knew where I came from. I believed I understood my place in a family that raised me as their own, protected me, educated me, and shaped my values. I carried gratitude quietly, the way you do when you think your safety is borrowed and conditional. I tried to be easy to love, useful, reliable, invisible when necessary. But there are truths that don't arrive loudly. They don't shatter the room or demand confrontation. They arrive slowly, through inconsistencies, silences, and small details that don't quite line up. When I discovered mine, it didn't explode my world. It clarified it. This is a story about that clarification. You won't hear villains here. You won't hear shouting matches or dramatic ultimatums. What you'll hear is a steady unfolding. How subtle dismissals become normalized. How silence can be mistaken for compliance. And how preparation often happens far away from the spotlight. You'll hear how I learned that love didn't change the fact that I wasn't meant to stay, and how accepting that didn't make me cold, it made me honest. I'm telling this story because so many people live inside families, relationships, or systems where they are valued but not fully chosen, where they are included but not rooted, where affection exists yet truth is managed. If you've ever felt that strange tension, being grateful and uneasy at the same time, this story is for you. I promise you this. What follows is not about drama. It's about clarity, not about punishment, but about alignment. And not about winning, just about leaving with your dignity intact. Before we begin, let me ask you something gently. Have you ever sensed that you were loved, but not quite meant to remain where you were? Before I understood anything about truth, I understood expectations. In my family, I was known as the easy one, the child who didn't argue, the one who adapted without complaint. If there was tension in the room, I learned how to soften it. If there was disappointment, I learned how to absorb it quietly so no one else had to. I didn't arrive in their lives loudly, and I learned early not to take up too much space once I was there. My parents, at least the people I called my parents, often spoke proudly about how well I turned out. They told friends I was mature for my age, very independent, so understanding. Those words were meant as compliments, and I accepted them as such. What I didn't realize then was how those compliments subtly describe my function, not my identity. I was raised with care. That part matters. I was clothed, educated, and encouraged to succeed. I was told I was loved, and I believed it. But love, I would later learn, can exist alongside quiet boundaries no one explains to you directly. In family gatherings, I wasn't the center, but I wasn't excluded either. I was the one who helped clear plates while conversations continued without me. The one asked to be flexible when plans changed. The one who understood when something just wasn't possible for me, even if no one could quite explain why. I learned to nod, to smile, to adjust. There was no cruelty in this. That's important to say. No raised voices, no deliberate neglect. Just a consistent positioning. I belonged, but I didn't anchor anything. If I disappeared from a room, the room would continue exactly as before. As a child, you don't question this. You internalize it. I thought being good meant being low maintenance. I thought gratitude meant silence. I thought love was proven by how little trouble you caused. When teachers praised me for being self-directed, my parents nodded approvingly, as if that trait confirmed something they already believed, that I didn't need as much. And so I learned not to ask. When decisions were made about the future, I was informed, not consulted. When family stories were told, I was included in the margins, never the origin. When conflicts arose, I was expected to understand everyone's perspective, including the ones that diminished me. I was very good at understanding. People often say children know more than we give them credit for. I agree. But what we know, we don't always know how to name. I felt different long before I knew why. Not unloved, just lightly held. At school, teachers described me as observant. Friends described me as calm. Adults described me as wise beyond my years. What none of them noticed was how early I learned to watch before speaking, to assess emotional temperature, to calculate the cost of being inconvenient. In my family, there were roles everyone played: the achiever, the protector, the peacemaker. Mine was subtle. I was the stabilizer, the proof that everything was fine. My presence reassured people that they were doing the right thing, whatever that thing was. And because I didn't resist, no one questioned it. I didn't see myself as invisible then. I saw myself as trusted. I believed my adaptability was a strength. And in many ways, it was. It taught me discipline, empathy, and emotional control. It taught me how to listen for what isn't said, how to survive without demanding reassurance. But it also taught me something quieter and more dangerous: that my place was conditional on how little I disrupted the story others were telling themselves. When people looked at me, they saw someone who fit neatly into the background of their lives. Someone dependable, someone grateful, someone who wouldn't complicate things by asking where she truly came from or where she was truly going. At that stage of my life, I didn't question it either. I thought this was simply who I was to them. And I accepted it, believing that belonging, even on the margins, was still belonging. I didn't yet understand that being raised as someone's own is not the same as being claimed without reservation. That realization would come later, much later. The first moment Ember wasn't dramatic. That's what made it stay. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, the kind that doesn't mark itself as important while it's unfolding. I was in my late teens, old enough to notice tone, young enough to still trust intention. We were sitting around the kitchen table, papers spread out, cups half finished, a conversation about the future, about college, finances, and timing, about everyone. Not about me directly, not at first. I remember listening more than speaking, the way I always did. My father, at least the man I called my father, was talking about plans, about what made sense long term. He spoke carefully, reasonably, the way people do when they believe they're being fair. At some point, I asked a question, a simple one, clarifying, practical. There was a pause. Then he said lightly, almost kindly, "Well, that's a little more complicated in your case." Your case. The room didn't react. No one corrected him. No one asked what he meant. The conversation simply moved on, flowing around that sentence as if it were nothing, as if it hadn't subtly reclassified me. I smiled, I nodded, I let it pass. But something inside of me didn't. It wasn't the words themselves, it was the assumption behind them, that my circumstances were fundamentally different, and that difference was understood by everyone else in the room, understood well enough not to require explanation. I told myself I was being sensitive, that adults sometimes speak imprecisely, that families have nuances. I'd spent my life making room for nuance. Still, that phrase echoed later, when I was alone. In your case. As if there were a quiet asterisk next to my name. As if the rules bent slightly when they reached me. After that, I began to notice small things. Not constantly, just enough to unsettle me. Documents that were shared freely among others, but summarized for me instead. Decisions were discussed after they were finalized. Jokes that relied on shared history I wasn't quite part of. I was always included, but rarely centered. Always informed, but never entrusted with the full context. No one meant harm, I believe that. But meaning well doesn't erase impact. The first cut is always small. That's how it avoids attention. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't even bring it up. I filed it away, the way you do when you sense that asking the wrong question might change how people look at you. I had learned long ago that curiosity could be costly. So I adjusted. Again, I became more careful with my words, more precise. I made sure I never sounded entitled, never sounded like I was assuming something that hadn't been explicitly offered. I waited for invitations instead of stepping forward. And everyone appreciated how understanding I was. What they didn't see was how my understanding had begun to sharpen into awareness. How I was starting to map the invisible lines in the room, where conversations shifted, where access ended, where my presence was welcomed but gently constrained. It would have been easier if someone had been unkind. Easier if there had been a clear moment of rejection. But there wasn't. Just that sentence, that pause, that assumption. Years later, I would replay that moment and realize it wasn't a slip. It was a reveal. At the time, though, I stayed quiet. I told myself it was nothing, that families aren't perfect, that love isn't always symmetrical, that gratitude means accepting limitations without resentment. And for a while, that was enough. But once you notice the first cut, you can't unsee the blade. It doesn't wound you immediately. It simply reminds you that your skin is exposed, that you're closer to the edge than you thought. Everyone else forgot that moment. I'm sure of it. I didn't. After the first cut, nothing changed on the surface. That was the strange part. Life continued the way it always had. Holidays, routines, conversations that felt warm and familiar. If I had been asked directly whether something was wrong, I would have said no, and I would have meant it. Because nothing looked wrong. Nothing was loud enough to point at. Instead, the pattern repeated quietly. There were more phrases like, "It's just different for you, and you'll understand when you're older," even as I became the oldest person in the room emotionally. There were decisions explained to me as if I were a guest rather than a participant. There were expectations placed on me without the corresponding authority to question them. I began to anticipate these moments before they happened. I learned where conversations would narrow, where my input would be politely acknowledged and gently set aside. I stopped offering opinions unless I was asked. And when I was asked, I answered carefully, leaving room for others to overrule me without discomfort. This is how disrespect becomes normalized, not through cruelty, but through consistency. No one ever said, "You don't belong here." They didn't have to. The structure of interaction did that work for them. I was useful, appreciated, and quietly peripheral. I was treated well as long as I didn't forget my position. I told myself stories to make it easier. They're just trying to protect me. They know more than I do. This is what family compromise looks like. I had a talent for empathy. I used it generously, often at my own expense. I excused omissions. I minimized exclusions. I framed my discomfort as immaturity. After all, I had been raised to be reasonable. And I was. What I didn't realize was how much emotional labor it took to remain reasonable in situations that subtly asked me to accept less. How tiring it is to keep smoothing over moments that quietly erode your sense of standing. Sometimes, I would catch myself wondering how things might feel if I pushed back, if I asked for clarity, if I named the pattern. The thought alone made my chest tighten, not because I feared anger, but because I feared becoming inconvenient. In our family, inconvenience was the unspoken line. Others could be emotional, others could be difficult, others could demand exceptions. I was praised for not needing any of that. My calmness became part of the family's self-image. See, everything is fine. She's fine. And so I stayed fine. I normalized being the one who adjusted. If a plan conflicted with my schedule, I rearranged. If a boundary felt unclear, I stepped back. If something hurt, I processed it privately and returned composed. That composure earned me trust, but it also earned me invisibility. Over time, the dismissals didn't register as events anymore. They became atmosphere, a quiet understanding of how things worked. I wasn't consulted about certain long-term plans. I wasn't included in conversations that required full transparency. I was expected to be grateful for what I had, without asking what I was owed. And I accepted that framework because questioning it felt like risking everything. That's the trap of normalized disrespect. It convinces you that asking for more is the real problem. I told myself that love doesn't need proof, that belonging doesn't need explanation, that if I stayed patient, things would naturally even out. I believed time would resolve what clarity might disrupt. But time doesn't resolve patterns, it reinforces them. As the years passed, I became exceptionally good at reading between the lines, at noticing what wasn't said, at recognizing when decisions were already made before discussions began. I stored these observations quietly, not as grievances, but as data. I still love them. That's important. My affection didn't disappear. My loyalty didn't vanish, but it began to coexist with something else, awareness. I started to see myself as someone passing through rather than rooted, someone included by grace rather than by right. It was a subtle shift, but once it happened, it colored everything. I stopped imagining the future where my place was unquestioned. I began to imagine contingencies instead, backup plans, emotional distance, carefully measured. And yet outwardly nothing changed. I was still the same Victoria, still calm, still reasonable, still grateful. They thought I was comfortable. What they didn't know was that I was adapting, not to stay, but to endure until I understood what staying truly cost. And by the time I realized that cost, silence was no longer just a habit. It was a strategy. Roles exist in families long before anyone names them. They settle into place quietly, reinforced by repetition, comfort, and convenience. By the time you notice yours, it already feels permanent. Mine had become clear. I was the reliable one, the one who could be counted on to understand, to adapt, to handle things without fuss. If something needed doing, I would do it. If something needed smoothing over, I would smooth it. I was efficient, emotionally controlled, and predictable in the best way. People trusted me not to complicate things, and that trust came with expectations. I was expected to show up when needed and step back when not, to carry responsibility without authority, to offer support without asking for visibility, to be present without being pivotal. It was never stated outright, but it was consistently reinforced. When others struggled, allowances were made. When I struggled, it was assumed I would manage. I had proven I could. In conversations, my role was often to listen, to affirm, to bridge misunderstandings between others. I became a quiet mediator, translating emotions, softening edges. People felt understood around me. They felt calmer. That made me valuable. But value is not the same as belonging. I began to notice how my usefulness peaked in moments of stress and faded in moments of celebration. I was essential when things needed handling, optional when things were joyful. It was as if my presence was functional rather than foundational. No one meant to assign me this role. That's what makes it powerful. It emerged naturally, shaped by my temperament and reinforced by everyone's comfort, including mine. I had learned early that being low maintenance was safer than being needy. That competence protected you, that if you carried yourself well enough, no one would question your right to stay. So I leaned into the role. I perfected it. I didn't demand reassurance. I didn't ask for guarantees. I didn't push for clarity where ambiguity served others. I told myself this was maturity, that I was above insecurity, that I didn't need what others needed. But roles are quiet contracts, and mine came with an unspoken clause. Don't ask to be more than this. The moment I began to sense that clause, something inside me resisted, not loudly but firmly. I didn't want to disrupt the system. I just wanted to understand it. So I watched. I noticed how decisions that affected my life were framed as settled facts. How discussions about the future rarely included me unless logistics were involved. How my emotional steadiness was taken for granted, even admired, but never deeply inquired into. People assumed I was fine because I never signaled otherwise. They assumed my silence meant agreement. They assumed my adaptability meant contentment. And I let them, because questioning the role meant questioning the foundation of my place. And I wasn't ready to do that yet. There's a strange safety in invisibility. When expectations are low, disappointment is unlikely. When you're not central, you can observe without being scrutinized. I told myself that staying in the background gave me freedom. In some ways it did. I learned how systems operate when you're not their focus. I learned how people behave when they think you're not paying attention. I learned how often gratitude is used as a leash, and how praise can become a substitute for fairness. Most importantly, I learned that being needed is not the same as being chosen. That realization didn't make me angry, it made me precise. I stopped trying to redefine my role. I stopped hoping it would naturally evolve. Instead, I began to see it for what it was, a position designed for stability, not growth, for support, not sovereignty. And once you see that, you face a quiet choice. You can keep performing the role, hoping it will eventually be rewarded. Or you can accept it fully and begin preparing for what comes after it. I chose the second path. Outwardly, nothing changed. I was still reliable, still calm, still useful, still invisible. But inwardly, something had shifted. I no longer mistook the role for my identity. I understood it as a temporary arrangement, one I had outgrown, even if no one else noticed yet. That understanding didn't make me confront anyone. It made me patient. The shift didn't happen during an argument. There was no revelation spoken aloud, no tears, no accusations, no dramatic exit. It happened in a moment so ordinary that, at first, I almost missed it. I was alone, sitting in a small public space, neutral, quiet, forgettable. I had gone there to think through something practical, nothing emotional. Papers in front of me, notes, a schedule, the kind of routine task I'd done 100 times before. And then I noticed something strange. For the first time, I wasn't thinking about how my decisions would affect anyone else. That absence stopped me. My mind had always run 2 tracks at once. What do I need to do, and how will this affect them? Even when no one asked me to consider their feelings, I did it automatically. It had become instinct. But in that moment, the second track was silent. I remember looking up, almost disoriented, as if I'd stepped into a room with different acoustics. There was no guilt attached to the silence, no rebellion, just clarity. I realized I had been living as if my presence required justification, as if staying was something I earned through good behavior rather than something I was entitled to by truth. As if my role was permanent, but my place was provisional. And suddenly, that logic no longer made sense. It wasn't anger that broke the pattern, it was understanding. I saw with unsettling calm that nothing was going to change unless I changed how I positioned myself internally. Not how I behaved outwardly, not how I spoke, but how I interpreted what was happening. I had been waiting for acknowledgement that was never going to be offered, not because they were cruel, but because the system worked just fine without it. That realization didn't hurt the way I expected. It didn't collapse me, it steadied me. I thought back over years of moments I'd filed away, the careful phrasing, the partial transparency, the way love was expressed without permanence, the way gratitude was expected without reciprocity. And for the first time, I didn't try to excuse it. I didn't blame anyone either. I simply accepted it. Acceptance is quieter than forgiveness. It doesn't require reconciliation. It just requires accuracy. I understood then that I had been loved in a way that fit someone else's limits, not mine. And that love, while real, had never been designed to hold me fully. That was the day I stopped interpreting silence as patience. I began to see it as a choice, not a choice to stay quiet forever, but a choice to wait, to observe without reacting, to gather without announcing, to move inward before moving on. I didn't confront anyone after that day. In fact, I became even calmer, more consistent, more agreeable on the surface. If anything, I seemed easier to be around. What changed was invisible. I stopped expecting fairness to emerge organically. I stopped hoping clarity would be volunteered. I stopped believing that loyalty alone could secure belonging. Instead, I asked myself a different question, one I'd never allowed before. If nothing here changes, what do I need to do to be okay anyway? That question rearranges you. It doesn't demand immediate action. It doesn't force conclusions. But it shifts the center of gravity from external validation to internal alignment. I didn't yet know what the truth was. Not fully. I didn't know what I would eventually uncover. I only knew that whatever came next, I would meet it prepared, not reactive, not desperate, not confused. That day, I closed my notebook. I packed my things. I walked back into my life exactly as it was. And no one noticed anything different. That was the point. The shift wasn't about leaving. It was about no longer needing permission to be whole. From that moment on, silence was no longer something I defaulted to. It was something I chose. After that day, I didn't announce any changes. There was no reason to. Announcements invite negotiation, and I wasn't interested in negotiating my inner shift. So I stayed quiet. But this silence was different from before. It wasn't compliance or endurance. It wasn't fear of disruption. It was intentional, measured, observant, purposeful. I still listened carefully. I still responded kindly. I still fulfilled expectations. On the surface, I remained exactly who they thought I was. And because nothing outward changed, no one adjusted their behavior either. That consistency became my cover. People often confuse silence with passivity. They assume that if you're not pushing back, you're not thinking ahead. They mistake calm for complacency. I let them. In conversations, I began speaking less, not because I had less to say, but because I no longer needed to say it out loud. I asked fewer questions. I volunteered fewer explanations. I let others reveal what they assumed I already knew. And they did. When people believe you are not a threat, they speak freely. When they believe you are grateful, they stop managing their words. I learned more in that period than I ever had before. I noticed how often plans were framed as inevitable, how decisions were justified by practicality rather than principle, how my understanding was taken for granted, even leaned on, to smooth over uncomfortable realities. They assumed my silence meant acceptance. It didn't. It meant I was paying attention. I started documenting, not obsessively, not emotionally, just factually. Dates, phrases, patterns. I wrote things down the way a researcher does, neutrally, without commentary. Over time, those notes formed a shape, a structure I hadn't been able to see when each moment stood alone. I wasn't gathering ammunition, I wasn't planning a confrontation, I was building clarity. And clarity is dangerous to systems that rely on ambiguity. Still, I said nothing. I continued to show up. continued to be reliable, continued to fulfill the role I'd been assigned. But internally, I had detached from the need to be seen as good, understanding, or easy. I no longer measured my worth by how little friction I caused. Others didn't notice this shift. Why would they? Silence looks the same from the outside, regardless of intention. They interpreted my calm as agreement, my consistency as loyalty. That misinterpretation gave me space. I began to see how easily emotional narratives are maintained when one person refuses to disrupt them. How often do people confuse the absence of protest with consent? How much they rely on your restraint to avoid examining their own choices. There's a strange power in being underestimated. It grants you invisibility at the precise moment you need perspective. During this time, I stopped offering emotional reassurance. Not abruptly, just gradually, I stopped filling in silences. I stopped explaining myself when no explanation was required. I stopped correcting assumptions that benefited me to leave unchallenged. None of this was hostile, it was neutral. If someone asked directly, I answered honestly, but briefly. If they didn't ask, I didn't volunteer. I let the structure speak for itself, and slowly, without realizing it, they revealed the limits of my place. They spoke about futures I wasn't included in. They referenced plans that assumed my flexibility. They made comments that clarified exactly how permanent or temporary they believed my role to be. Every revelation landed quietly, like a piece of a puzzle clicking into place. I felt no rush, no panic, no urge to confront, because once you stop needing to be understood, you gain time. Time to prepare, time to align, time to decide. Silence, when chosen, is not absence. It's presence without interference. And in that presence, I began to see the outline of something I hadn't allowed myself to consider before. Not how to fix things, not how to be seen, but how and when to leave. What people rarely notice is what happens when you stop reacting and start observing with intent. Because I didn't announce my shift, they assumed nothing had shifted at all. I was still there, still available, still dependable, still responding when needed. To them, I was static. I wasn't. Quietly, methodically, I began preparing, not for conflict, but for independence. Preparation doesn't always look dramatic. Most of the time, it looks like learning, reading, asking neutral questions, noticing how systems actually function beneath the language used to describe them. I started paying closer attention to documents, what was shared, what was summarized, what was kept informal. I learned which conversations happened in which rooms and who was present when real decisions were made. I noticed how authority was exercised without being named. And I noticed something else. How often my absence from those spaces was assumed, not negotiated. No one said, "You don't need to be here." They just never expected me to be. So I stopped expecting to be invited. Instead, I learned how things worked without needing an invitation. I educated myself quietly about legal structures, financial arrangements, rights, responsibilities, not because I suspected wrongdoing, but because I no longer trusted reassurance as a substitute for clarity. I wanted to understand the framework that defined my life, not just the story told about it. I kept my questions neutral, practical, almost boring. That made them easy to answer. People don't guard information they don't think you'll use. I wrote everything down, not emotionally, precisely. Dates, language, patterns of omission. I haven't interpreted yet. I just collected. This wasn't paranoia, it was due diligence. What struck me most during that period was how little resistance I encountered. My preparation didn't trigger alarms because it didn't look like rebellion. It looked like competence, responsibility, maturity. Traits I'd been praised for my entire life. They never noticed how my focus had shifted from being useful to them to being stable for myself. I also began to position myself differently in subtle ways. I stopped overcommitting. I created buffers in my schedule. I built independent routines, financial, emotional, logistical, that didn't rely on shared assumptions. None of this required confrontation, it required patience. Sometimes I felt a flicker of sadness, not because I doubted my direction, but because I realized how invisible this work was to the people who believed they knew me best. They saw the same calm exterior and assumed continuity. They didn't see the structure forming beneath it. There were moments when I almost said something, when a comment landed close enough to the truth that it would have been easy to ask for clarification. But I didn't, not because I was afraid, but because I no longer needed their explanation to proceed. Clarity had replaced permission. As the picture became clearer, so did the boundary of what I was and wasn't entitled to expect. I stopped hoping for inclusion where it had never been offered fully. I stopped interpreting care as commitment, and that changed how everything felt. I no longer experienced confusion when plans didn't include me. I experienced confirmation. I no longer felt hurt by partial transparency. I recognized it as consistent behavior. Patterns stop being painful once you stop expecting exceptions. Throughout all of this, my behavior remained unchanged. I didn't withdraw affection. I didn't become cold. I didn't test anyone. I simply stopped investing emotionally in outcomes that had never been mine to shape. That emotional detachment wasn't bitterness. It was efficiency. I was conserving energy for what mattered next. They never noticed the preparation because it didn't disrupt their narrative. I was still fulfilling my role, still supporting, still calm. They thought I was stable. What they didn't realize was that stability was no longer tied to staying. It was tied to readiness. By the time everything I needed was in place, not externally, but internally, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not urgency, not anger, certainty. And certainty doesn't announce itself. It waits. The truth didn't arrive all at once. It never does. It emerged the way fog lifts, not dramatically, not suddenly, but enough for the outline of the landscape to finally make sense. By the time I discovered it, I was already prepared to receive it calmly. What I found wasn't a secret hidden maliciously. It was something closer to an omission that had solidified over time. A truth assumed unnecessary to explain because it made things inconvenient. A detail quietly managed so the larger structure could remain undisturbed. I won't describe the discovery in specifics, not because it was explosive, but because it was precise. It involved records, timelines, paperwork that told a story different from the one I had lived inside. And when I saw it, I didn't feel shocked. I felt confirmation. Everything I had sensed, the careful language, the conditional belonging, the invisible ceiling, aligned instantly. There was no scrambling to reinterpret the past, no emotional whiplash, just a quiet internal click, like a lock finally turning. Of course, that was the thought. Not how could they, or why didn't anyone tell me, but this explains everything. The family that raised me had loved me. That part remained true, but the truth clarified the nature of that love. It had been structured, limited, quietly managed. I hadn't been positioned as someone who would stay indefinitely, not because I wasn't worthy, but because the system had never been built to accommodate my permanence. And suddenly every earlier moment made sense. The phrasing, the exclusions, the way my future had always been discussed was in hypotheticals rather than commitments. I sat with the information alone. I didn't call anyone. I didn't cry. I didn't pace the room. I read it again, then again, not to confirm accuracy. I trusted my understanding, but to observe my reaction, to see if something in me resisted the truth, if denial would rise. It didn't. Instead, I felt something surprisingly grounding, relief. Relief that my instincts hadn't been flawed, that the unease I'd carried wasn't ingratitude or insecurity, that I hadn't imagined the distance, I had simply lived inside it without language. This was the leverage, not leverage over anyone else, but over my own narrative. Once you know the truth, you stop negotiating with illusions. I understood then that nothing I had done differently would have changed the structure. No amount of patience, competence, or emotional generosity would have transformed conditional love into unconditional belonging. The limits were never about my behavior. They were structural. That realization removed something heavy from my chest. Responsibility, the kind that doesn't belong to you but settles there anyway when you're the adaptable one. I didn't feel the urge to expose anyone. There was no desire to confront or correct. What would that achieve? The truth didn't need witnesses to be real. It only needed to be integrated. I spent the next few days doing something that might look insignificant from the outside. I reorganized my notes. I separated facts from interpretations, events from emotions, patterns from assumptions. I mapped what I knew and what I no longer needed to question. This wasn't preparation for confrontation. It was preparation for the exit, not an abrupt one, not a dramatic one, but a clean one. The kind that doesn't rely on anyone else's understanding to be valid. As I sat with the truth, one sentence surfaced quietly, fully formed. My parents raised me as their own, then I discovered the truth. Both halves were true. Neither canceled the other, and holding both without resentment felt like power. That night, I slept deeply. No spiraling thoughts, no rehearsed conversations, just rest. Because clarity is restful. The next morning, nothing changed outwardly. I still answered messages, still showed up, still played my role. But the ground beneath me was no longer shared. I was standing on my own understanding now. And from that position, one final question became unavoidable. Not urgent, not emotional, just inevitable. Knowing this, what do I choose next? Once you know the truth, indecision becomes a kind of dishonesty, not toward others, but toward yourself. I didn't rush into action after the reveal. I let the knowledge settle, not because I was afraid of it, but because I wanted to see what it changed without my interference. I wanted to understand my options clearly, without emotional noise. There were several paths available to me. I could confront them, ask for explanations, demand acknowledgement, insist on being seen fully now that the truth was no longer hidden. That path offered the possibility of validation, of hearing my experience reflected back to me in words, but it also required something I was no longer willing to give, my emotional energy to a structure that had already shown me its limits. I could stay silent and continue as before, armed with knowledge but unchanged in behavior. I could accept the love that was offered, within its constraints, and build my life around it. Many people choose this. It's not weakness, it's pragmatism. But I knew myself well enough to recognize the cost. Staying would mean continuing to edit parts of myself. It would mean shrinking future decisions to fit a space that had never fully held me. There was a third option, quieter and more demanding. I could leave, not physically at first, not dramatically, but decisively. I could withdraw my future from a story that had never truly included it. I could stop orienting my life around a place where my presence was contingent. That option was irreversible. Once chosen, there would be no return to innocence. No pretending the structure might shift. No waiting for inclusion that was never promised. I sat with that reality for a long time. What made the decision difficult wasn't fear, it was affection. Love doesn't disappear just because clarity arrives. And part of me still cared deeply about the people who had raised me, who had supported me in real ways, who had done what they could within their understanding. But love doesn't obligate self-erasure. That was the sentence that finally settled it. I realized that staying, truly staying, would require me to accept a version of myself that was permanently partial. Someone is always adjacent, always adaptable, always quietly grateful. And leaving would require something else entirely, courage without applause. I didn't need closure conversations. I didn't need apologies. I didn't need acknowledgement to move forward. What I needed was alignment between what I knew and how I lived. So I chose the irreversible path, not out of anger, not out of spite, out of respect for myself. The decision wasn't announced. It didn't come with ultimatums or deadlines. It took place internally, fully formed, like a door closing quietly behind you. From that moment on, I stopped planning my future in relation to theirs. I stopped asking myself how choices would be received. I stopped considering whether paths would be approved. I stopped waiting for signs that it was safe to step fully into my own life. I gave myself that safety. Choosing to leave doesn't always mean immediate distance. Sometimes it means reclaiming authorship. Sometimes it means redirecting loyalty from a system to your own integrity. That was what I did. I didn't know exactly how things would unfold. I didn't need to. The direction was enough. Once the decision was made, something unexpected happened. The tension I'd lived with for years dissolved. There was no rush, no adrenaline, just a steady sense of rightness. I hadn't burned a bridge. I had simply stopped standing on it. After the decision, I didn't feel the urge to explain myself to anyone. Explanations invite debate, and I wasn't debating my own life anymore. So I moved in silence, not the dramatic kind, the kind people romanticize, the practical kind, the kind that looks like paperwork, planning, and patience. I began untangling my life from shared assumptions. Financially, I made quite adjustments. I redirected accounts, clarified ownership, ensured that nothing essential depended on informal understandings or verbal assurances. I didn't accuse anyone of malice. I simply stopped relying on trust where structure was required. Legally, I educated myself further. I didn't panic or assume the worst. I just made sure I understood where I stood, on paper, not emotionally. Knowledge has a way of removing fear without adding hostility. I also started making choices that signaled independence without announcing it. Long-term commitments that didn't factor in anyone else's preferences. Career decisions that were aligned with my values, not proximity. Routines that didn't assume availability. None of this triggered an alarm. Why would it? I had always been capable, always responsible. They interpreted my actions as growth, not separation. That's the advantage of being underestimated. You're allowed to evolve without suspicion. I didn't withdraw affection. I didn't become distant. I was still present in conversations, still responsive, still respectful. I simply stopped offering access to my internal deliberations. My inner life became private, and privacy changes power dynamics without confrontation. As the weeks passed, I noticed something telling. No one asked what I was planning. No one inquired about my long-term direction. They assumed continuity because it was comfortable to assume it. That assumption worked in my favor. I finalized arrangements that made departure, emotional and logistical, possible at any point. I built flexibility into my life, not escape routes, just autonomy. Every step I took was reversible, except the mindset behind it. That mindset had already crossed the point of no return. There was a strange calm in this phase. Not excitement, not dread, just momentum. Each action reinforced the next. Each decision affirmed the last. I wasn't waiting for the right time anymore. I was preparing for the right conditions, ones defined by stability, not permission. Occasionally, a moment would arise where I could have said something, where I could have hinted at change, where I could have tested whether anyone noticed the shift. I didn't, because testing is still seeking a response. And I was done seeking. Instead, I focused on coherence, making sure my life made sense to me, even if it didn't register to anyone else yet. The most telling part? Nothing broke. No one confronted me. No one questioned my direction. No one sensed loss on the horizon. The structure continued functioning as it always had, unaware that one of its quiet supports was slowly withdrawing her future from it. That's how systems fail, not with explosions, but with unnoticed absences. By the time everything was in place, there was no rush left in me, no anxiety, no countdown. I could have stayed longer, I could have left sooner, but timing, I learned, is not about urgency. It's about readiness, and I was ready. The consequences didn't announce themselves either. They arrived the way imbalance always does, subtly, indirectly, first felt rather than named. At first, it was small things. Requests that came a little later than usual, conversations that felt slightly less smooth, plans that required more effort to coordinate. Nothing dramatic enough to raise concern, just enough to create friction where there hadn't been any before. I noticed it immediately. They didn't. Because when you've always been the stabilizing element, people don't recognize your absence as absence. They experience it as inconvenience, as inefficiency, as a vague sense that something is off, without being able to identify what. I was still there technically, still responding, still showing up, but I was no longer compensating, no longer anticipating, no longer absorbing gaps before they became visible. And that's when the structure began to feel the difference. Someone forgot an important detail that I used to quietly track. A conversation escalated that I would have normally softened. A decision was stalled because no one stepped in to resolve the tension. I watched all of this calmly, not with satisfaction, but with recognition. This was what happened when I stopped holding the invisible threads together. What struck me most was how quickly people became unsettled. Not because they missed me, but because they missed the function I had served. The emotional buffer, the quiet organizer, the unspoken translator. They felt the loss without knowing its source. Comments began to surface. Things feel more complicated lately. Everyone seems more stressed. We used to handle this better. They spoke as if the shift were atmospheric, unrelated to any one person. I didn't correct them. I simply observed how rarely my name entered the analysis. That was telling. When systems rely on someone's invisible labor, they don't credit that person when things work, and they don't recognize them when things begin to fail. They assume the function will reappear, the way it always has. So they waited, for me to step in, for me to smooth things over, for me to restore equilibrium. I didn't, not because I wanted them to struggle, but because stepping back was part of telling the truth. I noticed subtle changes in how people spoke to me, a touch more urgency, a hint of expectation, as if they sensed, on some level, that I could fix what was unraveling, but wasn't. They didn't accuse me, they didn't confront me. They simply leaned harder, and for the first time, I didn't lean back. That was when confusion entered the room. Not anger, not blame, confusion. Because confusion arises when people don't know which rules are still in effect. They were operating under the assumption that my role was permanent, that my availability was constant, that my adaptability was unconditional. I had quietly withdrawn my future from that contract. Still, no one asked why. They asked when. When can you help with this? When will things feel normal again? They didn't ask if I would, and that distinction mattered. I answered politely, briefly. I helped where it aligned with my boundaries. I declined where it didn't, without justification, without explanation. No drama, no speeches, just different behavior. That's when unease began to set in. Because unease isn't triggered by conflict. It's triggered by unpredictability. And I had become unpredictable, not emotionally, but structurally. They no longer knew what to expect from me. And systems don't like that. I could sense the beginning of something larger. a reckoning that hadn't yet found language, the realization that something essential had changed, even if no one could articulate how or when. They felt the consequences before they understood the cause, and by the time they started looking for explanations, the center of gravity had already shifted. I was no longer holding the system together. I was standing outside of it. The moment people realize something is wrong is rarely the moment they understand what it costs to fix it. At first, they tried small adjustments, more check-ins, more questions framed as concern, more casual invitations to talk things through. None of it addressed the actual shift, because none of it acknowledged why the shift existed in the first place. They weren't trying to understand me. They were trying to restore equilibrium. That difference matters. I could feel the anxiety rising beneath their politeness, the subtle urgency behind conversations that used to feel relaxed. The way my presence was suddenly noticed, not for who I was, but for what I had stopped providing. It was never framed as a loss. It was framed as confusion. You seem different. Everything okay? You don't talk as much as you used to. I answered honestly but minimally, yes, I'm fine, just busy. All of that was true. What I didn't say was that fine no longer meant available, and busy no longer meant postponing my own life for theirs. They started revisiting old assumptions, trying to locate the moment things changed. But they were searching in the wrong place, looking for an argument, a conflict, a visible rupture. There wasn't one. That made it harder, because systems are built to respond to crises, not clarity. As the discomfort grew, so did the attempts to pull me back into alignment. Not aggressively, never that, gently, reasonably, with concern that looked like care. They referenced shared history, gratitude, how much we'd always meant to each other. They reminded me of stability, continuity, the value of keeping things as they were. What they didn't do was ask what I needed now. That question would have required acknowledging that my needs might no longer fit the existing structure. And that acknowledgement came too late. I could see the regret forming, not sharp, not dramatic, but uneasy, the kind of regret that comes from realizing you may have underestimated someone's capacity to leave quietly. They began offering things that once would have mattered to me. More inclusion, more consideration, more transparency. But those offers arrived after the underlying truth had already settled. They were responses to disruption, not expressions of understanding, and that distinction told me everything. I listened. I acknowledged their effort. I didn't dismiss it. But I didn't reverse course, because repair requires timing as much as intention, and the timing was gone. I wasn't angry. I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady. That steadiness confused them even more. People expect resistance to be emotional. They know how to counter anger, how to negotiate hurt. They don't know what to do with calm resolve. The more composed I remained, the clearer it became that this wasn't a phase, not a mood, not a misunderstanding. It was a conclusion, and conclusions don't reopen for discussion. I could see the moment when they realized that appealing to my patience, the trait they had always relied on, no longer worked, that the leverage they thought existed was gone. Not because I had taken something from them, but because I had reclaimed it for myself. They wanted to fix what they felt slipping, but what was slipping wasn't a relationship. It was control over the narrative. And once that's lost, it doesn't come back through reassurance. I think that's when the panic truly set in. Not loud panic. Quiet, internal panic. The kind that looks like hesitation, second-guessing, regret that can't quite find a voice. They sensed it was too late, but they didn't know what exactly had ended. I did. What had ended was my willingness to live inside a role that required my silence to function. And that ending didn't need agreement to be final. The conversation, when it finally happened, didn't feel like a confrontation. That surprised them. It happened because it had to. Not because I demanded it, but because the uncertainty had become unbearable. When systems lose predictability, they look for anchors. I had once been one. So they asked to talk. Not urgently, not dramatically, carefully, as if tone alone could return things to how they were. We sat together in a familiar space. Nothing about the setting suggested conflict. That was intentional on their part, I think. Familiarity can be persuasive. It reminds people of who you used to be. They spoke first. They talked about concerns, about distance, about how things felt off. They asked if they had done something wrong, if I were unhappy, if something had changed. I listened, really listened, not to prepare a response, but to understand what they were actually asking. They weren't asking for the truth. They were asking for reassurance. And that's where the difference became clear. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't list grievances. I didn't recount history. I didn't present evidence or demand acknowledgement. I spoke simply. I told them I had clarity now, that I understood my position in the family, not emotionally, but structurally, that I wasn't angry and I wasn't accusing anyone of harm, that the love I'd received was real, but limited. They tried to interrupt gently, to soften the language, to explain intentions. I let them finish. Then I said something that changed the temperature of the room, not because it was harsh, but because it was final. I'm not asking for anything to be different. I'm just letting you know that I'm living differently now. There was a pause. They asked what that meant. I told them the truth, without heat, that I wouldn't be orienting my future around the family anymore, that I wouldn't be filling gaps by default, that I wouldn't be available in the same ways. Not as punishment, as alignment. They looked for emotion in my face, anger, hurt, resentment, something they could respond to, something they could negotiate with. There wasn't any. What they saw instead was composure. And composure is unsettling when people expect vulnerability. They tried again, offering understanding, adjustments, reassurance that things could change, that they could do better, that they hadn't realized. I believed them. And still I said no, not sharply, not dismissively, just clearly, because this wasn't about effort anymore. It was about truth. I told them that love doesn't require permanence to be real, but it does require honesty to be sustainable, and that I had reached a point where staying would mean betraying myself, even if no one intended that outcome. No one shouted, no one cried. That too surprised them. When the conversation ended, it didn't feel unresolved. It felt complete. They didn't get the reaction they expected, and I didn't get the validation I once would have wanted. What I got instead was something quieter. Release. I stood up, I thanked them for listening, and I left. Not storming out, not lingering, just leaving, because sometimes the most powerful confrontation is the one that doesn't escalate, only clarifies. And once clarified, there was nothing left to argue about. Leaving didn't transform me overnight. There was no dramatic reinvention, no sharp break between who I was and who I became. What changed was quieter and deeper. I stopped measuring myself against a space I was never meant to fill. For a long time, I had defined myself through usefulness, through emotional steadiness, through how well I could adapt to other people's expectations. Those traits didn't disappear when I stepped away, but they stopped being the foundation of my identity. Now they are choices. I am still calm, still observant, still capable of holding complexity without panic. But those qualities belong to me, not to a role I was assigned. The absence of bitterness surprised me the most. I had expected grief, maybe anger, something to process. But what I felt instead was a lightness that came from no longer negotiating with reality. I didn't need to reinterpret the past to move forward. I didn't need to diminish what I'd received or exaggerate what I'd lost. I simply accepted the shape of my story. I was raised with care. I was also raised with limits. Both can be true without canceling each other. In the life I live now, my decisions are rooted, not reactive, not provisional. I don't ask myself whether I'm allowed to want what I want. I don't wait for external confirmation before committing to a direction. That shift alone changed everything. Relationships feel different now. Not louder, not more intense, but more precise. I pay attention to how people respond when I take up space without apologizing, when I say no without explanation, when I don't rush to smooth discomfort. The right people adjust. The wrong ones reveal themselves, and I no longer feel responsible for managing that outcome. I've learned that quiet dominance isn't about control. It's about coherence. When your internal truth and external behavior align, you stop sending mixed signals to yourself and to others. That alignment creates gravity. People listen differently now. They don't assume access. They don't expect me to carry what isn't mine. Not because I demanded respect, but because I stopped offering myself in fragments. Sometimes, I think about the version of me who stayed silent out of fear of losing love. I don't judge her. She was doing what she needed to survive. She didn't have the information I have now. What I gave her, eventually, was honesty. And honesty is kinder than accommodation when accommodation costs you your sense of self. I don't see my past as something to escape from. I see it as training. It taught me discernment. It taught me restraint. It taught me how to leave without burning anything down. Most importantly, it taught me that love doesn't justify permanence. You can care deeply and still go. You can be grateful and still choose distance. You can walk away without turning anyone into a villain. Who I am now is not someone defined by what I endured, but by what I chose once I understood. I stand on my own ground, not hardened, not closed, just clear. And clarity, I've learned, is the most sustainable form of strength. There's a belief we don't talk about enough, that if love is present, staying is the moral choice. I believed that for a long time. I believed that gratitude meant endurance, that loyalty meant silence, that if you were treated kindly, you didn't get to question the shape of your place. I believed that leaving, even quietly, was a kind of failure. I don't believe that anymore. What this experience taught me is something simpler and harder. Love does not cancel truth, and truth does not require drama to be valid. My parents raised me as their own. That mattered. It shaped me. It gave me stability when I needed it most. I will never deny that. But love didn't change the fact that I wasn't meant to stay. Not because I was unwanted, but because the structure was never built for permanence. Because my presence was always conditional, even when the affection was real. Because some roles are designed to support, not to endure. Understanding that didn't make me resentful. It made me precise. There is a difference between being included and being claimed, between being cared for and being anchored, between being welcomed and being rooted. When you live in that in-between space for too long, you start shrinking your future to fit it. You tell yourself you don't need more. You learn to be grateful for less. Quiet dominance begins the moment you stop doing that. It doesn't require confrontation. It doesn't require exposure. It doesn't even require agreement. It requires one thing only: honesty with yourself. Not the loud kind, the private kind. The kind that asks, if nothing here changes, can I still become who I'm meant to be? If the answer is no, then staying becomes a kind of self-betrayal, no matter how gentle the environment appears. Leaving doesn't mean you erase the past. It means you stop sacrificing the future to protect a story that no longer fits. I didn't leave in anger. I didn't leave to teach anyone a lesson. I left because clarity arrived. And staying after clarity is a choice, not an obligation. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is walk away without making noise. Not to punish, not to prove, but to live fully, without apology. If this story resonated with you, I want to ask you something. Not to answer here unless you want to, but to sit with honesty. Have you ever been loved in a way that asked you to stay smaller than you truly are? If you have, you're not alone, and you're not ungrateful for wanting more. Thank you for listening.